There have been a series of panics. Actually, the reason we refer to the Great Depression is that Hoover didn't want to use the word panic. So all the way through that second half of the 19th century, you had a level of instability, and it crested in 1907 when there was a major panic. And J.P. Morgan was famous for pulling together the banks and saying, we've got to do something to stop this. So that triggered action by the Congress and studies and commissions, and there were serious proposals that were voted down. Wilson was elected, and he felt that, in fact, that last proposal wasn't too bad. He could change it in a way he thought would work well. And in fact, that's what happened. Although, thinking of today's discussion of partisanship, it passed largely on partisan lines. That is, with Democratic support, but not much Republican support. Well, it's varied. I think one of the things you want to look at is Milton Friedman's path-breaking work about the Great Depression, where it turns out the Federal Reserve tightened and raised interest rates at just the wrong time, and almost everyone now agrees that that exacerbated what had started with the collapse of the stock market. In other eras, post-World War II, there was a remarkably steady era. I can remember Time magazine wringing its hands over an inflation rate of 1.2%. So they had quite a record. Then the 1970s, and we entered a combination of not only high inflation, but slow to no growth. Hence, we talked about the 70s as the era of stagflation. Volcker became the chairman of the Federal Reserve, tightened the tourniquet on the money supply, drove interest rates very high, but in the end, he squeezed inflation out of the system. Since that time, again, you had a period of relative stability. Minor recessions that were involved often with the Fed, let's say, tightening the money supply, turning the faucet a bit, so slowing the flow of water, or in this case, the flow of money. Now we've entered today, and you have an enormous challenge where the Fed has almost been the only warrior at the party. Fiscal policy after the initial stimulus bill in early 2009, there's been everything moving fiscal policy in a tightening direction despite high employment and low growth, high unemployment and low growth. So the Fed has stepped in with moving aggressively into uncharted territory, to the point where they've now on their third what they call quantitative easing, which is really printing money and hoping that this is going to drive down long-term interest rates, which it has, which will lead to considerable growth in investment, which is not clear that it's had that impact, particularly if you look at smaller businesses. And it would, of course, have a predictable impact in driving up asset prices, which in fact has happened. And if you drive up asset prices, the theory is, and there's lots of evidence to support this, you feel wealthier, you spend more, and that's good for helping to revive the economy. In the 1970s and into the early 80s, there was new legislation which emphasized the duality, emphasized the importance of the Fed's commitment to reducing unemployment as well as maintaining stable prices. So that tension still exists, and there is apprehension in some quarters that with all that liquidity out there, at some point, it's going to translate into higher prices. What's happened, to use an economist term, is that the velocity of money has been low. That is, people just haven't been turning over money the way you'd expect when it is so low in price, the interest rate being the price for credit. So it's a question about, will that happen at some point? And if it happens, how will the Fed respond? Or the Fed, which has now been buying $85 billion worth of securities every month, how will they at some point not only reduce their purchases, but even unwind the purchases that have been made? And no one is quite sure how that's going to happen. Well, there are people who look back at the 2 centuries of currency, gold standards, silver certificates, and so forth, and they worry about that lack of an anchor. And there are people who would be, you might say, have a flexible gold standard in mind. So you tie the dollar or the any currency to a set value of gold, and there'd be some exceptions. They'd understand if you're in a war, you're not going to tie yourself in that way, or if you're in a horrible depression. But that this would be a useful discipline. Because right now, what we have is the full faith and credit of the United States. That piece of paper is going to be accepted by you, and that you can give it to someone else and they'll accept it. So in a sense, we are kind of in a Bitcoin age, because the Bitcoins, which are sort of the darlings of the moment, really depend on whether people will accept them or not. And you look back to the parts of the 19th century where there was really not any central direction to monetary policy, and banks issued their own certificates. In the Depression, where communities fell on really hard times, they didn't have any tax money coming in, they issued kind of script that sometimes looked like money. I know in my hometown of Pendleton, Oregon, they had a little script with a picture of Sheriff Taylor, a very popular man, on it. So there has been this acceptance. Do you have confidence in that piece of paper? And there certainly are serious people who say, on the one hand, we really need to think about that gold standard. And then there's serious people who look back and say the gold standard was one of the problems. We couldn't adjust easily enough. I think it's a major achievement. One of the things that we ignore often by focusing on Wilson's foreign policy and the League of Nations and his vision for the world. I have a poster that says, Woodrow Wilson fights for America and all humanity. And in that sense, we are still very much in a Wilsonian age. But there were so many institutions. Women got the right to vote. The Federal Reserve, which you can't really imagine running a modern financial system without some sort of major central regulatory authority. He created the Federal Trade Commission. His first Underwood tariff, achieved in his very first year in office, was really part of the progressive movement to control monopolies. So you really have to think about how many domestic achievements there were to complement his role on the global stage.